If you have your Bibles with you this morning, we're going to be flipping through a lot of passages, but you can find your way to Genesis chapters 1 all the way through chapter 3, and you can follow along as we get through those things, but we're going to be in lots of passages, and I hope you brought a pen and maybe you'll write a few things down. The title of the message is The Problem of Evil, but I could have just as easily named it The Problem of Pain, but I want to revisit an important subject. This morning, what I decided I wanted to do, really based off of some conversations this week, just having a number of members say, hey, we want to come, we want to hear something different, we want to hear that God is in control. I really decided that I wanted to take a break from our series on the story of Jesus and really just kind of deal with where we're at as a society and maybe speak a little bit of confidence in all of this. I think as people of faith, we have to lead the way in these endeavors. We have to address these things. And as well as I do, as news reports of the virus having spread, gatherings have been canceled, people have lost fortunes, and our national leaders in some ways have created a panic. It's really important for us as believers to have a proper view of God. In fact, that proper view of God and His sovereignty is the thing that gets us through these moments, really, because none of what's going on around us should unsettle us. I might even say it should not even surprise us. It should not unsettle us at all. Let me introduce it like this morning. The morning of April the 20th, 1999. That's a day that sticks out in my mind. It began like every other morning for many men and women, and they awoke from their beds, they made their coffee, they prepared their kids for school, and they went to work. Nothing probably seemed out of the ordinary on that day many years ago. Around 11:10 a.m. at a local school, two students arrived separately, and one parked on the south side and the other parked on the west. And in between them was a glass window wall which led to the school cafeteria. After a brief meeting by one of the cars, the two young men set into motion the events that would shake the foundations of schools for many, many years to come. Armed with 20-pound propane bombs, two 12-gauge shotguns, a carbine 9mm rifle, numerous pipe bombs, and semi-automatic handguns, the two students began their attack. At around 11:17 a.m., the propane bombs began to explode. That created chaos. At 11:19 a.m., two students began their intrusion, killing a student by the name of Rachel Scott and severely wounding her friend as they were just eating lunch outside the cafeteria wall. Over the next 50 minutes, 12 students and one teacher was killed. 20 other students and one teacher was wounded, and it would all come to a conclusion when the two gunmen eventually would kill themselves there at Columbine High School. There are a few events, I think, in human history, few events in our life that leave indelible marks. For me, that was one of them. I just happened to be the right age. When the massacre was concluded, there were questions that were being asked across this nation, weren't they, for those of you who remember well? Was there any evidence prior to the events that these two young men were going to do this? Another question that was asked during that time was, what role did a violent video game by the name of Doom play in the perpetration of these events? How did that impact all this? But the question that was on a million minds, I think most importantly, was more simple than that. The question on a million minds was, where was God? Whenever you have a discussion about brokenness, specifically as it relates to the world in which we live, beloved, inevitably one has to answer the question concerning the existence of pain, suffering, and evil in the world. Unfortunately, the events of Columbine, they sparked a chain reaction over the years to come. As a result of the shooting at Columbine, schools have been pondering the questions of school security and making changes for over 20 years now. You know what's interesting about that? Is that for all of the security and the changes in technology and the way in which law enforcement gathers its information, since Columbine, school shootings like that one have increased by over 800%. Then there are the events of September the 11th, 2001, right? Everybody remembers where they were at on that day. I remember walking through the hallway from my dorm room that day and meeting one of my friends in his National Guard uniform as he was rushing to answer the call of his country that had called him into service. All of those questions, they present even more questions. Not that long ago, I was having lunch with a friend, and we began to talk about this Columbine shooting, and he posed the question like this. He said, "Pastor, don't you think that there were parents that morning who prayed for their children? We believe in the power of prayer, do we not? Why weren't those students protected on that day?" At the heart of that question, those are difficult questions, but at the heart of those questions and the many more, rage a question which has been the struggle for many. If we believe in a sovereign God today, what do we do with all of the evil? What do we do with the pain? What do we do with the suffering as it happens in the world today? To be sure, the question is not only asked after events like Columbine and September 11th. It's asked when when a person is dealing with cancer in their bed, or a scene of an accident, or when a tornado rips through Joplin or Nashville, Tennessee, when a virus covers a globe. People want to know, where is the sovereign God? You believe in a sovereign God, where is He? The question of evil gets really to the heart of human frailty, doesn't it? In moments like this, we start to realize just how weak we really are. We begin to understand that we don't have this thing under control, that the world itself really is chaotic. I made a comment this week to one of my friends. I said, "Isn't it amazing what can happen? What can happen when the media decides to say something, right? You know, the reality is the statistics tell us, this isn't a part of my notes, but the statistics tell us that the actual percentage rate is going down in the spread of the disease, according to the CDC, and yet what has happened is one basketball player got a disease. One major league association decided to cancel. Everybody else said, we're going to cancel. And in a moment of 12 hours, cities, gatherings were all shut down. Isn't it amazing? Now, you may agree or disagree with those decisions, but isn't it amazing how just over a period of 12 hours, things can go from what is a seemingly calm event, under control, to utter chaos. It gets to human frailty. It gets to our weakness. We begin to understand how out of control we really are, do we not? Maybe you guys live like that. Maybe you're just like the Guffeys and you have young kids. You're just out of control all the time, so nothing has happened in your life, right? But we realize just how out of control, how frail we are as human beings. When God created the world, beloved, He placed in this perfect garden two human beings, didn't He? Adam and Eve. He gave them only two commands when He created them. That was, they were to work the ground, to be fruitful and to multiply, and to never eat of the tree of knowledge. A couple few commands. The serpent comes along in Genesis 3 with an offer. You can read it later for yourself. He wanted them to eat of the tree of knowledge, and He gave them the promise that on the day that they did eat of that tree, that they would become like God. How could they be like God in that moment? That is, the serpent was offering to them that they would have knowledge and understanding as God has knowledge and understanding. They would know for the first time in human history what was right and what was wrong. They would have complete understanding of the world in which they habitated, right? They would understand all things. But what man learned there in Genesis 3 on that frightful day was that the knowledge that was offered by the serpent was nothing more than a mirage in a dry and barren land. Millenniums later, we still don't understand the world, do we? And for this reason, we ask the question over and over again, what do we do with pain, suffering, and evil in the world? I have spent 11 years as your pastor here at Cornerstone Baptist Church, and I have affirmed over those 11 years, each and every step of the way, that we believe in a sovereign God. It is the only thing that allows us to bury two children. It is the only thing that allows us to bury a father, a grandfather. It is the only thing that allows us to walk into a hospital room and cheer on a man or woman going through cancer. We believe today in a sovereign God, a God who is in control of every aspect, that He would know our thoughts and actions before they are even put into motion themselves. He knows our locations, and He is everywhere. He is everywhere all the time. He even created our genetic makeup, including our personalities and our desires. In other words, if you don't like the way you look, take it up with God, right? If you don't like the way your husband acts, his personality, take it up with the Lord. It is not his fault. We believe in a sovereign God. But if we believe in a sovereign God, and further, if we believe in a good God, which we've also argued, then how in the world could there be evil in this world? Beloved, for the believer, it seems a difficult question. Maybe not on a philosophical level, but a practical level. But for the unbeliever, it seems to be evidence against the existence of God. Do you not know that the enemy wants to take these things and convince people that God does not exist? So what is the answer? What is our response in moments like this? Well, unfortunately, whenever you have a question like this, there are always lots with their sincere motives who offer the wrong answers. One such answer is to reject God's existence. That's atheism. Atheism answers the problem of evil by basically assuming that the evil is a result of bad luck in our world, at the game of chance, or it's direct result of human activity, right? We caused all this ourselves. But in either case, the direct result is meaningless and it's despairing. For there's no objective judge who makes the right and wrongs committed in this life. There's no protection from evil, and there is no future life in which justice could prevail. The atheist doesn't have good answers. The second answer, unfortunately offered by many who profess the name of Christ, is to reduce God's sovereignty. Now, they have many forms under which they do that. One would be open theism. I was having this discussion with Brother Chuck this week about open theism. Basically says that God chooses not to know certain things, right? The open theist says that God basically got up and decided that he didn't want to know that the coronavirus was going to spread across the globe, but he'll react to it now that it's out there. That's a bad answer. There are those who believe that in foreknowledge, or they profess a foreknowledge. In other words, God's not really in charge, but he just looks into advance. But really, they say he's helpless in that because he has to just let it play out. Then there were men like our founding fathers in our country who professed to be deist. Deism basically says that God created the world, he wound it up like a watchmaker winds up a clock, but he has to just sit back and let it unwind. He's not really in control. And then there are others who reject God's sovereignty completely, and they emphasize human sovereignty. Well, if we would just make better decisions, none of these things would ever happen. Unfortunately, those are even more dangerous than atheism because they come from the pulpits across this land. But they are stripped of the hope that the gospel brings. The third answer was to attack God's character oftentimes. Some have said, maybe God just isn't good, as Christians have said that he is. Most recently, an answer given in Christian Science, whatever that is. In Scientology, the answer was to just ignore evil altogether, to say that evil is nothing more than an illusion, right? That it's really just a matter of the mind. Interestingly enough, they still vaccinate their kids, but it's still an illusion, right? Or other religions, unfortunately, it has crept in some Christian circles. They offered solutions of karma and reincarnation, right? That we're just getting back to us what we have been due for a long time. Beloved, the problem of evil, the problem of pain and suffering, it's supposed to be an attack on Christianity, and unfortunately, it has won the day in too many circles across this land because of really bad, improper understandings of biblical truths in the pulpits of America. The reality is the Bible offers in several places the answers to our questions. And I would submit them to you this morning that I would suggest to you, Christianity offers the only real and hopeful answer to the problems of evil, pain, and suffering. Not atheism, not Christian Scientology, nothing else. Christianity alone has the answer to the problem of evil and suffering and pain in this world. I want to today set those answers out in front of you. Not merely from a pragmatic basis or a philosophical basis, but rather we set out to find those answers, to lay those answers out, to answer those questions, because how we answer the question has real ramifications in which we live. 3 biblical answers this morning. First answer to the question is found in the first 3 chapters of the Bible, specifically in creation and the fall accounts of man. Why does evil exist in the world? And the first answer we are given in the first books of the Bible is because sin has overcome the perfect creation of God. In Genesis chapter 1, we are told of God's creative work, that He created the heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, and all of their galaxies, right? That He created the plant kingdom and all of its kind, the animal kingdom and all of its kind, and the fish of the sea and all of its kind. Ever wonder why God created a mosquito, by the way? Then God all of a sudden breaks His precedent there in Genesis 1, and He stops from that created measure and He begins to create mankind. And He makes him distinctly different from the rest of creation. That is, that He makes man in His image. As God created, He paused each and every time. The Hebrew writer says that the Trinity responded within itself to say, it is good. That phrase, it is good, that Hebrew phrase, it speaks of perfection. That is, that after something was created, whatever it was there in Genesis 1, God affirms that it could not have been created any better if He'd given it 1,000 more chances, right? It could be no more perfect than it was if you gave Him 1,000,000 more times. As a part of that perfect creation, God makes man to be this moral entity. Man alone would have the distinction. We call it reason, right? He'd have a mind, something he could think with. He did not lay before anything else in the world any options. He created the animals according to their kind were shown, with a nature and a way of living that would correspond to live in the garden. But when God creates man, so as to make man the reflection of Himself, He makes man to reason and to think, to be able to be moral, to understand right and wrong. And He laid before man a choice. Some say that God did not create reason until he ate of the tree, but that's not true. How do I know that? Because He laid before man a singular choice, to obey Him or not to obey Him. And for this choice, man would be held morally responsible. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, the Lord God took the man and He put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but the tree of knowledge and of good and of evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. On that day, God gave man a choice to obey Him or not to obey Him. But He also stated the ramifications of that choice, did He not? To obey meant that man would live forever in the garden with God, to be in perfect communion with God and in His creation. And to disobey, conversely, would lead to the introduction of death and destruction into the created world of perfection, right? Well, you know how the story plays out. In Genesis 3, man is tempted by the serpent and he falls, right? And the result of that temptation, that ending is cataclysmic. God promised death to mankind, and he was kicked out of the garden, and the tree of life was taken away from him. He's no longer accessible to it. God promises in Genesis 3 that war amongst mankind would happen, and that there would be enmity between man and woman. When you fight with your spouse today, remind her that it is man, Adam and Eve's fault that you're having that discussion, right? The ground which had been perfect would now, he says, bear thorns and thistles, extending the ramifications of the fall even to nature itself. We have natural disasters today because of this moment in history, Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve said, we are going to determine our own destinies. We're going to operate on our own accord. In short, beloved, the world that you and I now inhabit is a world far, far, far fallen from Eden. You and I today, we have no conception of what that perfect world that God created was, do we? What we encounter is a world full of natural disasters. But that was not the world that God created. Science has proven this, by the way, through Big Bang cosmology. They discovered several years ago that the universe was expanding. You say, well, why is that important? Well, they discovered that the world was winding down essentially with that expansion, that the natural gases, resources, and energy being used, and there would come a day when we would expand so much that there would be no more. Well, as John Polkinghorne from Harvard or Oxford University said, if the world is expanding, that means it had a definite beginning point. There was a moment at which the world had not existed but now existed. They actually proved the biblical narrative in their attempts to disprove the creation account. Beloved, the first reason today that evil exists in the world is because of sin. It's because of us. Natural disasters, they are the result of that original sin. As the world is fighting as though it were a woman in labor, yearning for the rebirth of a new heavens and a new earth. I was not a fan of that movie Noah that came out a couple of years ago, but I did catch it on television, and there was one line that was accurate in the midst of all of that inaccuracy. In response to the flood, Noah says to his family, God didn't do this, man did. It may have been the only factual piece of information in the entirety of the movie, because it was right. Man brought the destruction of evil that was necessary into the perfect world when we sinned in Adam. The world today is cataclysmically different than the way it was when it was first created. But sin extends beyond the natural disasters, does it not? For as we stated, God created man morally responsible. That is, that man has to choose his sin. He cannot lay the burden against God, but rather it is done so willfully. As C.S. Lewis wrote, there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say, thy will be done, and to those whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell chose it. Without that self-choice, there would be no hell at all. This moral responsibility, now that does not infringe upon God's sovereignty. It is a part of His decreed plan, and we don't have time to discuss that at length today, but we affirm both truths. And because God made man morally responsible, and man continues to choose evil, the end result is what Paul describes in Romans 1, when he states that man has become inventors of evil. All of that to say, at one time or another, all of us have had to, at one time or another, deal with evil brought on by another's moral responsibility. Have we not? Someone else made a choice, and I had to deal with that as a result of their choice. But likewise, others have had to deal with the ramifications of our choices, my choices from time to time. Have they not? Ravi Zacharias, he tells the story of a prominent businessman. I've told it before. Essentially, on one occasion, he had this opportunity to meet with this prominent businessman, and who spent his entire encounter sitting there railing against the evil that is found in the world and what's wrong with this, right? And after several minutes of listening, an associate of the man turned to the businessman. He'd actually introduced Ravi to him, and he asked the man a simple question. He said, you've been talking about all the evil in the world, but I have a simple question for you. What do you do with the evil in your own heart? Romans chapter 3 is clear on this matter, that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And were it not for God's intervention, none of us would ever be able to come to Him in the first place. The question, why do bad things happen to good people, is really not a fair question according to Scripture. Because Romans chapter 3 affirms that there really is no such thing as a good person. Turn to the person to your right and say, you're not all that good, right? Turn to the person to your left and say, at least I'm better than you. But at the heart of the question, why do bad things happen to good people, is a question of justice. It's not fair, we say. It's not fair. That leads us to a second answer to the problem of evil. When Adam and Eve fell on that fateful day, the wheels of motion were set and the world was cataclysmically changed, right? But God in that moment did not become impersonal or inactive, because through the action and ending results of evil that were brought, those things brought about the greatest message in human history. God's gospel. God's redemption. We would not even know God's redemption if it were not for that fall. The Genesis writer tells us in chapter 3 that as God was prophesying of the destruction of sin, He also promised a deliverer. Did you know that? In Genesis 3, He not only tells them what's going to happen, how the world's going to fall apart, but He promises them a deliverer. One, He says, who would have his heel bruised by the serpent, but whose heel would crush the serpent. It was a prophecy of the coming of Christ, all the way back in the beginning of time, and His death on the cross of Calvary. Because on the cross, His heel, yes, it would be bruised. In fact, the enemy thought he had won. But in the resurrection, the serpent was defeated. As Colossians 2 tells the story, Christ openly triumphed over the principalities and powers, and He put them to shame. As painful as evil is. And as it has impacted each and every life in some form or fashion, if you live this world, you're going to be impacted by it. The beauty of God's redemptive plan was coming into the world. You see, beloved, through evil, God is most glorified. You say, how does that work? Think with me for a moment. Without darkness, we don't even know what light is, do we? The cross, it's the pinnacle of that truth. For there on the cross, the plans of evil men were put together and they came to fruition. They murdered an innocent Savior. The acts themselves were so violent and excruciating that day that had we been there, we probably would have thrown up. And yet in the midst of all of that ugliness was the beauty of God. That's why we sing the song, right? Oh, the wondrous cross. That God would send His Son to die my death on the cruel cross and redeem me in a world of sinners unto Himself. It's tough, and we don't want to minimize evil or punishment or suffering in any day. That is not our plan this morning, beloved. But beloved, in the ugliness of evil can be and always is the beauty of Jesus Christ. For God is magnified in those most dark moments. The darkest of days makes one more clearly see and appreciate the light when it comes into the room. Am I right about that? In the darkest of days, that's when one more clearly sees God's precious light pierce. Paul would say it like this in Romans 8. I reckon that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed unto me one day. What was the glory being revealed? Was it a glorified body and 18 holes before lunch every day in heaven? Probably not. The glory he spoke of was the glory in Jesus Christ. Job knew that truth as well, that God was most clearly seen in the darkest of days. He had lost everything, and the Bible went to great lengths to tell us that he was a righteous guy. He didn't deserve any of it, right? And right there in Job chapter 42 and verse 5, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you. Beloved, the second reason for evil, as painful as it is for me to say this, are the purposes of God in redemption. You see, through pain, through suffering, through evil, you and I see God's redemptive plan, and we behold the glory of Christ. That leads me to a third and final point this morning. Third, and it's perhaps the most difficult to accept, but I would suggest to you this morning that evil, and I don't use that word lightly, that evil, that pain, that suffering, even they are a part of God's good purposes in this world. I want you to listen very, very carefully to me this morning. I am not suggesting that God is culpable or guilty concerning evil. I am saying that He is sovereign in evil, that even evil serves the purposes of God. That is, that nothing happens without a purpose or a plan. Some have suggested that it would be better to limit God's sovereignty in order to protect God, but to do so comes at a very high price. It would be better to see God's own revelation, and I'll give you three illustrations. First, the pinnacle is the cross, which we've talked about already, of which Peter preached about on the day of Pentecost. But listen to Peter's sermon. Peter first lays out the case that Jesus was delivered over to be crucified at the hands of lawless men, Acts chapter 2. And then he says in verses 22 and verse 23, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, this Jesus delivered up according to, listen to this, the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Did you notice who was in control? God. God did not merely use the evilness of the cross, but He says definite, right? He had a definite plan at work through the lawlessness of man itself. Then there's the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. You know his story. He's sold into slavery by jealous brothers. He's slandered and thrown into prison, cheated by a trusted cellmate. Then Joseph finally stands face to face with his brothers after all the miraculous things, and everybody wonders, what is he going to do to them? They are the ones who created this in his life. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He turns to his brothers, those who started the chain reaction of events that led him through all of that pain, all of that suffering. And he turns to his brothers and he says these words, Genesis 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. I want you to notice, beloved, he did not say that God merely made it good. He said God intended it for good. In other words, you may have thought that you were acting on your own accord, but even your sinful actions were a part of God's sovereign purposes to lead me to this moment, because he knew that I was the one to save the many during this time of drought. Even years and years and years before the drought came into the land, God, according to his purpose and plan and sovereignty, through the sinful actions of man, was raising Joseph up through a chain of events so that a nation could be saved. Third, maybe the toughest verse of all, Amos chapter 3, verse number 6. Is a trumpet blown in a city and the people are not afraid? Maybe I could put this in modern times, right? Has Fox News not got a new banner and the people are afraid, right? Does disaster come to a city? Listen to this. Unless the Lord has done it. Here the Lord used calamity in the city. Why? To show the error of their way. God had a purpose in that evil. He wants the armies to come in. He wants the city to be destroyed, because in that evil he knows he will finally capture the people's attention. What do we do with that truth? Well, number one, this morning it means that we take confidence because God is in control. Somebody should have gotten excited about that. It means that God is in control. Any other answer leaves him out of control. Even good answers like he just looked into the future, right? But what that means is that if he just looked into the future, he chose not to do anything about what he knew, right? To understand that God is in complete control over these things, to understand that even he is in control of the evil, even of the punishing things, even of the painful things, even of the suffering, to understand that all of that is a part of his sovereign care means that he is in control and he will work all things out for our good and for his glory. We hold fast and we are not despaired, for in the darkest of nights we know that God is in control and at work for the good of those who love him and are called, Paul says, according to his purposes. How do we understand evil? 3 ways this morning. First, evil is, first and foremost, the direct result of a sinful world that we live in. It's a natural chaos. It's the ramifications of man's moral responsibility given to him all the way back in Genesis 1. Second, we use evil as the lens by which we see the glory of God more clearly. In short, in old country preacher form, without the bad days, we would not understand what the good ones were. And third, we see behind the evil the good purposes of God, and we trust his character. Because we trust his character, we know that he's in control. This morning, my prayer for you is that this truth would guide you not just during this season, but it would guide your hearts and minds through the seasons to come. One of the preachers last night, he said, I know these things. He says, in the Christian life, you are either in a valley, going into a valley, or coming out of a valley, right? When I was growing up, my pastor would say, you're either going into a fire, coming out of a fire, or are in the fire. The point that all of them are trying to make is that if you live in this thing called life long enough, you're going to go through these difficulties. And it is only from personal experience and the conviction of God's truth, it is only the sovereignty of God that gets you up in the morning with a smile on your face, hope in your heart, conviction of the mind to say, it's all going to be okay.